The desert wind carried dust through the cracks of the small wooden shack where Apacha sat on the dirt floor, her thin fingers wrapped around her mother's silver locket. The metal felt cold against her palm, but it was all she had left of the woman who had sung her to sleep with ancient Navajo lullabies. Outside, the Arizona sun blazed mercilessly, turning the landscape into a shimmering mirage of heat and desperation. Apacha's stomach cramped with hunger, a familiar sensation that had become her constant companion over the past 3 weeks. The government rations had stopped coming to their remote settlement, and the trading post 15 miles away might as well have been on the moon for all the good it did her. She had no horse, no wagon, and no money to buy food, even if she could make the journey. Her father had died in a mining accident 2 months earlier, crushed beneath a collapsed tunnel while working for wages that barely kept them alive. Her mother had followed him to the spirit world just 3 weeks later, weakened by grief and the tuberculosis that had been eating away at her lungs for years. At 19, Apacha found herself alone in a world that seemed determined to erase her people from existence. The locket caught a ray of sunlight streaming through a gap in the wooden planks, sending tiny reflections dancing across the walls. Inside the delicate silver case was a photograph of her grandmother, a woman who had witnessed the Long Walk of 1864 when thousands of Navajo people were forced from their homeland and marched to internment at Bosque Redondo. Her grandmother had survived those terrible years and returned to rebuild their lives on the reservation. But now, Apacha wondered if all that struggle had been for nothing. She pressed the locket to her forehead and closed her eyes, remembering her mother's voice telling her stories of their ancestors. "We are strong people," her mother had whispered during her final days. "The earth remembers our footsteps, and the wind carries our prayers. Never forget who you are, my daughter." But strength felt like a luxury when her body was consuming itself from the inside. Apacha hadn't eaten in 2 days, surviving only on sips of water from the well behind the shack. The well that was slowly running dry, just like everything else in her life. A sound outside made her lift her head. Hoofbeats were approaching, slow and steady. Apacha pushed herself to her feet, swaying slightly as dizziness washed over her. Through the window, she could see a lone rider on horseback, silhouetted against the harsh desert landscape. Fear and hope battled in her chest as the stranger drew closer. The rider was a Navajo man, older than her father had been, with long gray hair braided down his back, and wearing traditional clothing that spoke of someone who held on to the old ways. His horse was well-fed and strong, a stark contrast to the skeletal remains of her father's horse that lay bleaching in the sun nearby. The man's presence commanded respect even from a distance, and Apacha instinctively knew he was someone of importance among their people. He dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who had spent a lifetime on horseback and approached her door. Apacha's hand tightened around the locket as she wondered what this stranger wanted. In recent years, visitors to their remote settlement usually brought bad news or government orders that made life even more difficult. "Ya'ate!" the man called out in traditional greeting, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. Apacha opened the door, her bare feet silent on the packed earth. Up close, she could see the kindness in the man's weathered face, though his eyes held the same weariness that seemed to touch all their people in these difficult times. His clothing was well-made but practical, and she noticed a silver bracelet on his wrist that marked him as someone of standing in the community. "Ya'ate," she replied, though her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. The man's experienced eyes took in her gaunt appearance, the empty water bucket beside the door, and the general air of abandonment that clung to the small homestead. His expression grew grave as he realized the desperation of her situation. "I am Thomas B. Gay," he said, introducing himself with the formal courtesy their culture demanded. "I have been traveling between the settlements, checking on our people. I heard about your parents, and I came to see if you needed help." Apacha's throat tightened with emotion. She had been alone for so long that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to have someone show concern for her welfare. But pride, that stubborn trait that ran in her family like a deep river, made her straighten her shoulders despite her weakness. "I am managing," she lied, though they both knew it wasn't true. Thomas Begay nodded respectfully, not calling attention to her obvious falsehood. "Your father was a good man. He worked hard to provide for his family. Your mother was known for her beautiful weaving and her knowledge of the healing plants. They are remembered with honor." The acknowledgement of her parents' worth brought tears to Apacha's eyes. In the white world that increasingly surrounded them, her parents had been just another pair of Indians to be ignored or exploited, but here was someone who recognized their true value, their contributions to their community and their people. "The drought has been hard on everyone," Thomas continued, his gaze sweeping over the barren landscape. "The government promises help, but their promises are like water poured into sand. They disappear and leave nothing behind." Apacha knew he was giving her an opening to admit her need without losing face. The older generation understood the delicate balance of pride and survival that their people had to navigate every day. But admitting her desperation meant acknowledging that she was failing to honor her parents' memory by keeping their homestead alive. "I have some possessions I could trade," she said carefully, her fingers unconsciously moving to the locket beneath her worn dress. Thomas's sharp eyes caught the gesture, and his expression grew thoughtful. Among their people, family heirlooms were sacred things, connections to ancestors and the continuity of their heritage. The fact that she was considering trading such an item spoke volumes about the depth of her desperation. "What kind of trade are you thinking of?" he asked gently. Apacha pulled the locket from beneath her dress, letting it catch the light. The silver gleamed despite the tarnish, and the intricate engravings around the edges showed the skilled craftsmanship of an earlier time when their people had more resources and freedom to create beautiful things. "This belonged to my mother and her mother before her. It has our family's protection prayers carved into the silver. But prayers don't fill an empty stomach," she said, her voice breaking slightly on the last words. Thomas Begay stepped closer, studying the locket with the respect such an artifact deserved. He could see the tiny symbols etched into the metal, protective designs that had been passed down through generations of women who understood the power of carrying their ancestors' blessings close to their hearts. "This is a precious thing," he said solemnly. "Your grandmother would have worn it during the long walk. It carries the strength of all the women who survived those terrible times." "I know," Apacha whispered, "but knowing its value doesn't help me when I'm too weak to stand." The admission hung between them like a prayer offered to an uncertain sky. Thomas Begay studied the young woman before him, seeing not just her physical hunger but the spiritual crisis that came with being forced to choose between survival and heritage. It was a choice no person should have to make. Yet it was one that their people faced with increasing frequency as the modern world pressed in around them. Thomas Begay stood in silence for a long moment, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he considered the young woman's desperate offer. The weight of leadership had rested on his shoulders for over 2 decades, and in that time he had seen too many of his people forced to make impossible choices between preserving their heritage and simply staying alive. "Put the locket away," he said finally, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected entire families and communities. Apacha blinked in confusion, her fingers still clutching the precious silver. "But you haven't heard my terms. I'm not asking for charity. This locket is valuable enough to trade for food and supplies." "I said put it away," Thomas repeated, though his tone remained gentle. "That locket belongs around your neck, not in some trader's collection where it will lose all meaning and power." "Then how am I supposed to eat?" Apacha's voice cracked with frustration and despair. "I've been alone here for weeks. The well is nearly dry, I have no food, and winter is coming. If I don't find help soon, I'll join my parents in the spirit world." Thomas walked over to his horse and untied a leather bag from his saddle. The bag clinked softly with the sound of metal implements, and Apacha caught the scent of dried meat and cornmeal wafting from its contents. Her stomach responded with an audible growl that made her cheeks burn with embarrassment. "When was the last time you ate a proper meal?" he asked, though the answer was written clearly in the hollow curve of her cheeks and the way her dress hung loose on her diminished frame. "5 days ago I found some cactus fruit. Before that I can't remember," she admitted. Thomas nodded grimly. He had seen the effects of prolonged hunger before, during the worst years at Bosque Redondo, when the government's promises of adequate food had proven to be as empty as their promises of fair treatment. Starvation had a way of stealing not just physical strength, but hope itself. "Come inside and sit down," he instructed. "I'm going to prepare something for you to eat, but you must eat slowly or your body will reject it." Apacha followed him into the small shack, her legs trembling with the effort of remaining upright. Thomas surveyed the sparse interior with the practiced eye of someone who had visited many struggling households. A few pieces of simple furniture remained, along with some of her mother's weaving supplies and a collection of pottery that spoke to her family's artistic heritage. From his bag, Thomas withdrew strips of dried mutton, cornmeal, some wild onions, and a small pot. "Do you have any water left?" he asked. "A little in the bucket by the door. The well still has some, but it's getting low." Thomas nodded and began preparing a simple but nourishing stew, moving with the confident efficiency of someone who had cooked many meals over open fires during long journeys. As he worked, he spoke in the rhythmic cadence of traditional storytelling. 25 years ago, when I was younger and thought I understood the world better than I do now, I encountered a situation much like this one. A family had been struggling through a harsh winter, and they came to me offering to trade their most precious possession for food. It was a medicine bundle that had been in their family for 7 generations. Apacha watched him add water to the pot and build up the fire in her small stove. The smell of cooking food was almost overwhelming after so many days of emptiness, and she had to focus on his words to keep from feeling dizzy. "What did you do?" she asked. "I made the same mistake many young leaders make. I accepted their trade because I thought I was helping them preserve their dignity while meeting their needs. I gave them enough food for several weeks in exchange for that sacred bundle." Thomas stirred the stew thoughtfully, his expression troubled by the memory. 6 months later, the old grandmother who had owned that bundle died. As she lay on her deathbed, she kept asking for it, wanting to hold it one more time before she crossed over. The family had to tell her it was gone, traded away for food that had been consumed long ago. Did she understand why they had to trade it? Understanding and accepting are different things. She died knowing that a part of her ancestors' protection had been lost, not through war or theft, but through the slow grinding poverty that forces our people to choose between their bodies and their souls. The stew began to bubble gently, filling the small space with rich aromas that made Apacha's mouth water. Thomas added some salt and wild herbs that he carried in small leather pouches, seasoning the meal with the same care her mother had once taken with family dinners. From that day forward, I made a promise to myself and to the spirits of my ancestors. No person under my protection would ever again be forced to trade away their heritage for basic survival. When someone comes to me in desperation, offering family treasures for food, I know that our entire community has failed them. He ladled the stew into a wooden bowl and handed it to Apacha, along with a spoon carved from bone. "Eat slowly," he reminded her. "Small bites and rest between them." Apacha took her first taste of real food in days, and tears sprang to her eyes at the richness of the flavor. The meat was tender and well seasoned. the broth warming her from the inside out. She forced herself to eat slowly despite her body's urgent demands for more. "This is the finest meal I've had in months," she said between careful spoonfuls. "Food always tastes better when it's shared freely rather than bought with tears," Thomas replied. He poured himself some of the broth into a smaller cup and sat across from her on a wooden crate. "But I still don't understand. If you won't accept my trade, why are you helping me? We barely know each other, and you have no obligation to a stranger." Thomas smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features and revealing the warmth that made him a natural leader among his people. "Who says we're strangers? Your father worked in the same mine as my nephew. Your mother traded her weavings at the same post where my wife bought supplies. Your grandmother and my mother were childhood friends who survived the long walk together. In a small community like ours, there are no strangers, only family we haven't formally acknowledged yet." The concept resonated deeply with Apacha's understanding of traditional Navajo social structures. The idea of kinship extended far beyond blood relationships to encompass the complex web of connections that bound their people together across generations and geographical distances. "Even so, I can't simply accept charity. My parents raised me to contribute my fair share, to earn what I receive." "And you will," Thomas assured her, "but not by surrendering the sacred things that connect you to your ancestors. There are other ways to contribute, ways that strengthen our community rather than diminishing it." As Apacha continued eating, Thomas outlined his plans for helping her rebuild her life. He spoke of seasonal work opportunities, of connecting her with other families who needed assistance with traditional crafts, and of longer-term solutions that would allow her to maintain her independence while remaining connected to her cultural roots. "The world is changing around us faster than many of our people can adapt," he explained. "But that doesn't mean we have to abandon everything that makes us who we are. Sometimes the old ways and the new ways can work together, like two streams flowing into the same river." The sun was beginning to set behind the distant mesas when Thomas Begay finished explaining his plan for Apacha's future. The young woman sat with the empty bowl in her lap, feeling more hopeful than she had in weeks. The warm meal had restored some of her physical strength, but more importantly, Thomas's words had rekindled something she had thought was lost forever, the belief that she had a place in the world. "My family has a compound about 30 miles north of here," Thomas explained, gesturing toward the mountains that rose like sleeping giants against the darkening sky. "We have several buildings, including a workshop where my wife and daughters create traditional jewelry and textiles for sale to collectors and museums. We also maintain a small school where children learn both English and our traditional language." Apacha listened carefully, understanding that he was offering her more than just temporary shelter. He was proposing a way for her to rebuild her life while remaining connected to her cultural heritage. "What would I do there?" she asked. "Your mother was known for her skill with traditional weaving patterns. Your father had a reputation as an honest man who understood the value of hard work. You carry both their talents in your blood. We need someone who can teach the old weaving techniques to the younger women, and we also need help managing the practical aspects of running our operation." Thomas stood and walked to the window, looking out at the stark landscape that had been Apacha's prison for the past few weeks. "The trading post owner in Gallup has been asking specifically for authentic traditional pieces. He has customers back east who collect Native American art, and they're willing to pay fair prices for quality work. Your skills could provide steady income while preserving knowledge that might otherwise be lost." The offer was more generous than anything Apacha had dared to hope for, but she still felt the weight of her family's abandoned homestead. "What about this place? My parents built this home with their own hands. They're buried on that hill behind the house. The dead don't need houses, but they do need to be remembered and honored," Thomas said gently. Your parents' memory will be better served by watching you thrive and carry on their traditions than by seeing you waste away trying to maintain something you can't sustain alone. He turned back to face her, his expression serious but kind. Besides, this land isn't going anywhere. In a few years, when you're stronger and more established, you could return if that's what your heart tells you to do. Or you might find that home is wherever your family and community surround you with love and purpose. Apacha fingered the locket at her throat, feeling the familiar comfort of the carved protection symbols. For the first time since her parents' deaths, she felt as though she was being offered choices rather than having decisions forced upon her by circumstances beyond her control. Your wife won't mind having another woman in her household? Thomas chuckled. Maria has been after me for months to find someone who could help teach our granddaughter the finer points of traditional weaving. She tried to learn from her mother, but my wife's talents lie more in silversmithing than textile work. She'll welcome you like a daughter, especially when she learns about your family's reputation for beautiful designs. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their discussion. Thomas moved to the window and smiled. Speaking of my wife, it appears she decided to follow me after all. Apacha felt a flutter of nervousness as she watched 3 riders approach the small homestead. The lead rider was a woman about Thomas's age, her long hair streaked with silver and braided with traditional ornaments. Behind her rode a younger woman and a man who appeared to be in his 20s. Maria worried when I told her I was coming to check on you, Thomas explained. She probably brought food and supplies, thinking one meal wouldn't be enough to restore your strength. The riders dismounted with practiced ease, and Apacha could see that Thomas had been right about the supplies. Each horse carried heavily loaded saddlebags, and the younger woman was leading a pack mule laden with provisions. Maria Begay entered the small house with the confident stride of a woman accustomed to taking charge of situations. She took one look at Apacha's thin frame and immediately began unpacking bundles of food, blankets, and cooking supplies. "Child, you look like a scarecrow," she said matter-of-factly, though her tone carried warmth rather than criticism. "When was the last time you had a proper bath and a full night's sleep on a real bed?" "Maria, this is Apacha," Thomas said, making formal introductions. "Apacha, this is my wife Maria, our daughter Sarah, and our son-in-law David." The younger couple stepped forward with respectful greetings, and Apacha was struck by how naturally they included her in their conversation, as though she were already a member of their extended family, rather than a stranger they had just met. "We brought enough supplies to get you through several weeks," Sarah explained as she and her mother continued unpacking, "but we're hoping you'll consider coming back with us instead of staying here alone." David was examining the structure of the small house with the eye of someone who understood construction. "The roof needs some work before winter sets in properly," he observed, "and that well won't last much longer without some maintenance." "We could arrange for the necessary repairs to be made," Thomas said to Apacha. "That way, if you decide to return someday, the house will be waiting for you in good condition." The practical arrangements being discussed around her made Apacha realize that Thomas's family had already decided to help her, regardless of whether she accepted their long-term offer. They weren't trying to pressure her into a decision by withholding immediate assistance. Instead, they were demonstrating through their actions the kind of people they were and the kind of community they had created. "I've never lived anywhere but here," Apacha admitted. "This is the only home I've ever known." "Change is always frightening," Maria said, sitting down beside her with a cup of fresh coffee. "When I was about your age, I had to leave my family's traditional territory to marry Thomas. I was terrified that I would lose myself by adapting to new surroundings and new responsibilities. But you didn't? I discovered that home isn't a place you live. It's a feeling you carry inside yourself. When you're surrounded by people who respect your heritage and encourage your growth, you can be at home anywhere." Sarah added her own perspective from the viewpoint of someone closer to Apacha's age. I spent 2 years away at a government school, where they tried to make us forget everything about being Navajo. When I came back, I was afraid I wouldn't fit in anymore, that I had lost too much of myself to belong here again. What happened? I learned that traditions aren't fragile things that break the moment you step outside familiar boundaries. The knowledge and values our ancestors gave us are strong enough to survive change and adaptation. They grow stronger when we find new ways to express them and share them with others. The conversation continued as the family worked together to make Apacha's small home more comfortable and well-supplied. They moved with practiced efficiency, clearly accustomed to helping community members who were facing difficulties. There was no sense of charity or condescension in their actions, only the natural response of people who understood that individual welfare and community strength were inseparably linked. As the evening deepened and preparations were made for the night, Apacha found herself studying the faces around her small fire. These people had entered her life as strangers, but they were treating her with the consideration and care usually reserved for family members. More importantly, they were offering her a path forward that honored both her need for survival and her desire to maintain her cultural identity. "I would like to come with you," she said quietly, her hand once again touching the locket at her throat. "At least for a while, to see if I can learn to be useful to your household and your work." Thomas nodded approvingly, but it was Maria who spoke for the family. "You're not joining us to be useful, child. You're joining us because you belong with people who understand your value and can help you discover your own strength. The usefulness will take care of itself once you're properly fed and surrounded by the support every young woman deserves." That night, as Apacha lay on a real mattress for the first time in weeks, wrapped in warm blankets and listening to the quiet conversation of people who had become her protectors, she felt her mother's presence like a gentle touch on her forehead. The locket lay warm against her heart, no longer a desperate last resort for survival, but a cherished link to ancestors who had endured their own trials and emerged stronger. Tomorrow she would leave the only home she had ever known, but she would carry with her everything that truly mattered: her heritage, her dignity, and the knowledge that she was not alone in the world. The desert wind that had once carried only emptiness and fear now seemed to whisper promises of new beginnings and unexpected family.